What is the true church? How can you be sure that you are in the right church? How do you know that you have not been deceived into the wrong church? Depending on what translation you use, there are 112 times that the word church is mentioned in the Bible. Interestingly enough, you will not find the word church in the Old Testament. However, you will find it 3 times in the book of Matthew, scattered throughout the book of Acts, in Paul's letters, and of course, the message to the churches in the book of Revelation. What does this English word church mean? Where did it come from? Now, the word church, and there's 2 theories about where it comes from. One is it's from a Greek word, kirche, which means house of the Lord. And it was passed down through the Goths and eventually through the Anglo-Saxons and ended up in English and other languages as well. The other theory, where this word church comes from, is it comes from the Druids. And they had this circus, which is hence they called it a kirk, and that became the word church. However, we have a problem because the Greek word that is translated church in the Bible is not that earlier Greek word at all, but a totally different word. The word that is translated into church is ekklesia, and that literally means to be called out, or called out, as it says here, in a body of citizens gathered to discuss the affairs of a state. However, academics, the scholars, argue about how this word applied in the New Testament times. For example, Lowe and Nida in their Greek lexicon say that some people try to make out that this means literally called out. But they're saying that in New Testament times, that is not how this word was used. They claim this word was used for several hundred years to mean assembly of people. So they say it's important to understand that ekklesia means an assembly of God's people. But why not both? After all, why not a called out assembly? After all, there are many scriptures that talk about us being called out of this world into God's family. In fact, a well-known scripture in John 6:4 says, no one can come to me unless the Father draws them. So we have this concept of the Father drawing us, in other words, calling us. So you've got 3 options in how you use this word ekklesia. It can mean called out ones, it can mean assembly or congregation, or it can mean a called out congregation or called out assembly. But if this word means assembly or congregation or called out, whatever you want to think it is, why is it translated church? Why isn't it translated assembly? Let's go back over 1,000 years and see why this word is not translated the way it's meant to. Notice what it says here in the Encyclopedia Britannica. The Greek word ekklesia came to mean church. It came to mean church. In other words, it didn't originally mean church. Its meaning was changed. And as they say here, it originally meant an assembly of citizens. In the Greek Septuagint, now the Septuagint translation is a translation of the Old Testament done in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And what happened was there were Jews living in Alexander, and the common language where they lived was Greek, and many of them could not read the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. So they translated it to Greek. And when they came across the word in the Old Testament for assembly, they used the Greek word ekklesia. In other words, they recognized that ekklesia meant an assembly to gather together. So that's how they translated this word in Greek. And according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the word ekklesia can mean the entire believing Christians in Matthew 16:18, and we're going to look at Matthew 16:18 in a lot of detail later on. Believers in a particular geographic area or meeting in a particular house, a house church. But why did this change? How did the early church use this word? What did they do? Well, the first Christians were Jews. The early church was mainly made up of Jewish converts. Later on, when Paul started to do his preaching to the Gentiles, more and more Gentiles were added to eventually they outnumbered the Jews. But for a while, the Jews were the dominant ones. And for them, they were familiar of using this word assembly. In other words, they saw ekklesia as a continuation that links the Old and New Testaments. In other words, they saw a link between the Old and New Testament. This is the first century church we're talking about here. See, the early Christians understood themselves as people of God. God had revealed himself in the Old Testament. They were the true children of Israel, with Abraham as their father and as a people of the new covenant prophesied in the Old Testament. So that's how they saw it. But something happened in the 4th century. We have the Nicene Creed. Now, some of you may have actually said this or recited this, perhaps in past life, because it is recited regularly in church and has been for thousands of years now. And this came about in the 4th century, the Nicene Creed. And this creed defined the word ekklesia, because the creed was originally written in Greek and was then translated into Latin and eventually other languages. The other thing about this Nicene Creed is it is recognized by all the mainstream Christian churches, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the major Protestant churches. They all recognize this creed. And this creed identifies ekklesia, which they read as church, as being one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. So they have these 4 marks or these 4 characteristics that they define ekklesia, church, as. The first one is oneness or unity. And they believe that if you're baptized, that is your entry into the church. Now, you might like to think, who does the baptizing? Who does the baptizing? The second characteristic or mark is the holiness of the church doesn't mean all the members are holy, but derives from its creation by the Holy Spirit. Now, think about that for a minute. It's saying not all the members are holy. But if we think about the original meaning of ekklesia, of being called out, if you're called out by God the Father, you're chosen, then you are a member of that assembly. But they're saying it doesn't mean that all. So you're starting to get away from the original meaning. The third characteristic was to be Catholic, and that word meant to be, it's a universal church. It's right around the world. It's a universal church. It's not a local congregation, even though when you look in the New Testament, it often referred to local congregations. As we saw before, it could mean a congregation, a house church. And it came over time to imply the Catholic Church, the Church of Rome. And the fourth characteristic is apostolic. And this implies the church and the ministry can be traced all the way back to the original apostles and Jesus. So the popes believe they can trace their origins through lineage right back, in their case, to the apostle Peter. Then we have this scripture in Matthew 16:18 that says, I say to you, and this is Jesus speaking to Peter, that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And that's the word ekklesia. And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. In other words, this church will last forever. It will be never destroyed. And then in verse 19, he says, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So now you have authority to make decisions and do things and change things as they saw it. So we have this disagreement. The original early first century church, mainly made up of people who were previously Jewish, they saw ekklesia as a continuation of the Old Testament ekklesia, the Old Testament assembly as they read in the Septuagint. However, now with this Nicene Creed in the 4th century, now ekklesia is an entirely new institution. It's no longer that Old Testament continuation. So there's a difference here happening. Now, I should add that ekklesia is a general term. It's not a religious term in Greek. So the ekklesia in the Old Testament comprised physical Israel. The ekklesia in the New Testament comprised spiritual Israel, but it is still an assembly. That's the point. But the composition of the assembly can change. So there's a difference here happening. Now, we also need to see this in the context of other historical things that are happening in the 4th century. Christianity was intent on replacing Judaism. In other words, they saw the Old Testament as being for the Jews, and they wanted to replace it. In other words, not to be a continuation, but to totally replace it with something completely new, and the message was a universal message, as we saw before. The New Testament was fulfilling the Old Testament. So you no longer needed the Old Testament because the New Testament had fulfilled it, and Christians now were the new Israel. It was a complete replacement. The God of justice, as they saw it, the Old Testament God with all these rules and all these commandments had been replaced, notice, by the God of love, replaced by Jesus the Christ. That's how they saw it. And some of the early church fathers taught that God had finished with the Jews. They had now prepared, that was their role, for his son, for Jesus to come. Now they should no longer be around. And then notice what else happens. The councils in the 4th century, they had these councils. And this is where they started to worship and enforce the worship of Sunday. They were told to worship the Lord's Day on Sunday and not the Sabbath. In fact, they were told to work on the Sabbath. And notice here they were told Christians were not to Judaize. In other words, Jews were associated with all the things in the Old Testament, so you mustn't do that because it's now been replaced. We're now new. So we have Sunday worship coming in. For example, this is when Easter comes in and replaces Passover and unleavened bread. And as we're talking about today, this is when Ecclesia's name is changed. It no longer means assembly. Now, we also must understand at this time, most people were illiterate. And if you could read and write, the chances of you being able to read a Bible are pretty low because Bibles had to be written by hand. They were very expensive. They were hard to access. And if you could access one, it probably wasn't written in your language. It'd be written in Hebrew or more likely a Latin translation. So people relied on the preaching of the priests in church. So that's where they learned. So they had no idea. They couldn't check out what the Bible said. They relied on the hierarchy of the church with its apostolic authority to teach them. But then comes the Protestant Reformation. Does that change all this? The trouble is, when the Bible was first translated into English, the idea of this universal church was already in existence in the Roman Catholic and the Protestant churches of the day. The word church was first used by Theodore Beza in 1556. Now, he was a Protestant. He was a Presbyterian. And he believed in the idea of a Catholic church, not the Catholic church, but a universal church, and its hierarchical form of government. Therefore, he used the word church instead of assembly. Beza believed in rigid obedience to authority. So let's look at the English translations, the first English translations, and what did they do with this word? The first English translation was by William Tyndale, and he translated ekklesia as congregation. He didn't translate it as church. And now those of you who know your history will probably be aware that this man eventually died for what he did, not just for translating ekklesia, but the whole idea of translations was a difficult thing at the time to do. The next translation was called the Great Bible. And King Henry, and you can see him there in the middle of the page there, he translated it also as congregation. Now, I'm not sure why he did that, but I'm suspicious that perhaps given the history at the time, he was breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church, and perhaps he wanted the word congregation to be used so people didn't read church and associate it with the Catholic Church. That's my theory. I'm not sure, but that's my theory. But it didn't last long because the next Bible came along and it translated ecclesia as church. Then we get to Elizabeth I, and there she is on the front cover of this Bible, and it's called the Bishop's Bible. Now, she didn't actually endorse it, but she certainly was quite happy about it, and this Bible continued to use the term church. And then we come to the most famous of all the English translations, the King James translation, which was published in 1611. Now, we also need to see this in a historical context because King James was originally the King of Scotland, but then he became King of England over all the United Kingdom. And he inherited a kingdom that was somewhat divided because the Scots historically had fought against the English. And as well as that, religiously, as well as having the Church of England, there was still a lot of Catholics around. The Church of Scotland was separate to the Church of England, and you had another Protestant group, also the Puritans. So he had to unite all these. Now, as well as that, he believed in the divine right of kings. That is, the king was only responsible to God. He was appointed by God, and he was not responsible to the people. So King James was very interested in ensuring that he was in charge. And he really liked the Church of England because the Church of England had a hierarchical structure with the king at the top, then the Archbishop of Canterbury, then all the bishops and so on, down through the ministry and so forth. So he really liked that structure. So he wanted to reinforce that structure. So when he assembled people to translate the Bible, he gave them some guidelines or some instructions to follow. Let's have a look at two of them. Article 1 of these guidelines was, wherever possible, to use the Bishop's Bible. And the Bishop's Bible, remember, translated ecclesia as church. But to make absolutely sure that everyone got the message, Article 3 says you must use the word church and not the word congregation. So what happened? Ecclesia was changed from assembly to church. When did it happen? In the 4th century. Where? In the Eastern Roman Empire. How? Through the Nicene Creed. And why? Because it was all about church authority, apostolic succession, all about reinforcing this church authority. Now, what about today? We've got lots of modern translations today. How do they translate this word ecclesia? Let's look at Matthew 16:18 again, which I looked at before, where we said to Peter, I will build my church, being ecclesia. How do modern translations translate Matthew 16:18? I did a review of this, and I found 55 translations that use the word church, and only 8 that use the word like congregation or assembly. Now, in those 8 are 2 Messianic Jewish translations, including the Stern translation that some of you may be aware of. And they would have been used to the Septuagint that used ecclesia. Another one was the Young's literal translation. Another one was a modern English version of the original Tyndale Bible called the Matthew's Bible, and a couple of other obscure translations. But in the 55 that translated this scripture as church are all the big name translations today. The New International Version's in there, the New King James Version, the New English Translation, the American Standard Translation, all the big translations are in the 55. If you went into a bookshop in the Bible section, the chances are you'd get one of those. And if you read them, you'd see the word church, even though it means assembly. Let's have a look at the context of Matthew 16 to give us a better understanding what's happening here. Now, Matthew 16 in verse 1 starts out with the Pharisees and Sadducees saying to Jesus, "Show us a sign." And then later on, he warns the disciples to be aware of the teachings of the religious leaders. And then he comes in verse 13 to a place called Caesarea Philippi. And it's a fascinating area because there are very few Jews live there. It's mainly populated by Gentiles. Let's have a look at this. Because in ancient times, in ancient Israel's time, this is where they worship Baal in this area. It was also where Micah set up an image there, a false image, and where Jeroboam the first set up the golden calf. So this area is associated with paganism in ancient times. But in the time of Jesus in the first century, it was also associated with the Greek god called Pan, and also there were temples there to Caesar there. So it was a very pagan area. Now the Greek god Pan, he looks half goat, half human. That's how he looks. And he haunted the high hills. Notice he haunted the high hills. And he was looking after flocks and herds, and he was a piper, and you can see the pipe in his hand there. Jesus takes the disciples to Caesarea Philippi. This is a fascinating area. Let me show you what it looks like. Now that's Mount Hermon. Now Caesarea Philippi was on the base of this mountain, on the lower foothills of this mountain. It's a very high mountain. You can see it's covered in snow here, and it's permanently covered in snow. So it's a prominent feature of the area. Just to give you an idea for some of the people here, Mount Hermon is 2,800 meters high. The highest mountain in Norway is 2,469. In Sweden, 2,097. And you lot in UK, your mountains are positively pimples compared to this mountain. The highest mountain in UK is in Scotland and Ben Nevis at 1,300 metres and Snowdon at 1,000 metres. Now, for the Australians in our audience, Mount Kosciuszko is the highest mountain in Australia, and it's 2,200. So it's between Norway and Sweden here. From those of you who are from New Zealand, Mount Cook's 3,700 metres. And we notice we've got someone from India. Well, your mountains are huge, 8,000 metres. Kenya's the highest mountain in Kenya is about 5,000 metres. But nevertheless, 2,800 metres really stands out. And it's about 25 miles from the Sea of Galilee. And so it's a dominant mountain in the area. And here is what Caesarea Philippi looks like. It's a very sharp cliff face and the mountains in the background there, and it's got this water flowing out from its base, and that's the river Banus, and it's a tributary to the river Jordan. So the river Jordan basically starts in this area, and there's a waterfall, a small waterfall in the area. Now if we go in close, you can see in the cliff face they've carved out hollows here, and their god Pan would have been sitting in those carved areas. I'll just show you what it looked like in the first century. This is an artist's impression of what it looked like in Jesus' day. So you've got the temple of Augustus there on the left. Behind that, you've got the Pan Grotto. You've then got the court of the Pan and the Nymphs. You've got Zeus Temple. You've got the court of Nemesis. And remember, many of these Greek gods were adopted by the Romans. Then you've got the temple tomb of the sacred goats. And you got the Pan temple and the dancing goats. So this is where Jesus is taking the disciples and where they're having this discussion. There's another picture of what this Pan god looked like. And here it is in a Roman mosaic here. And notice it's half goat, half human. The disciples are in the area of Caesarea Philippi. Jesus asks a question. Who do people say I am? And they reply, Some say you're a prophet. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist. They have all these different ideas about who Jesus is. Then Jesus looks at the apostles and says, "Who do you say I am?" Remember where they are. They're amongst all these pagan stone statues, these pagan stone buildings. And they've got this massive cliff face in front of them. Notice what Peter says. And this is what Peter says. And think of the environment. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." The living God. In other words, the true God is not like all these stone statues, these dead stones, these rocks of no consequence, these buildings. You are the Son of a living God, the living God. So this is an incredible statement because it's showing Peter understood something. The Pharisees said, "Show us a sign." Peter didn't need a sign. He could see that Jesus was the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to Peter after this in the next verse, "God the Father revealed this to you." And then it's then that we get this statement where Jesus says, "You are the rock and build my church." But let's have a closer look at the Greek words used here. Because the word Peter here comes from Petros, and the word rock comes from Petra. "And I will build, orkandimo, my church, ekklesia." So let's have a look more at these Greek words. Rock, Petra denotes a massive rock. It's a huge rock, like that cliff face at Caesarea Philippi. Where Petros, which is the Peter, it's a detached stone or boulder, a stone that could even be thrown or easily moved. And orkadimo means literally to build a house, or can be translated to build anything. So if we put the underlying Greek words into Matthew 16:18 here, we can see that he's saying, "Unto you, Peter, a boulder, something that can be moved, or even a smaller rock, on this massive cliff face," and he's standing in front of this massive cliff face, "I'm going to build my house of called out assembly." Now, you can choose whether you put house in there or not. I haven't found a translation that does, but that's what it literally means, a house of a called out assembly. And he's going to build this assembly. So you can see when you put the original Greek meaning in there, this is very different to saying build a church. It's building a called out assembly. Now, Stern in his commentary says ekklesia never refers to an institution or a building. So the idea of the Nicene Creed that this is an institution, a church institution like the Catholic Church or the Church of England, that's not what ekklesia means. In fact, Stern translates it here, ekklesia, as a community, another word meaning an assembly or a congregation, a community. It's not a church. So we can see what's happening here. The meaning is changing. But then let's ask the question. Who makes up the community? Who makes up the assembly? Who makes up the congregation? We, the call out ones, we make up the assembly. The Bible refers to sheep flocks as an analogy, another type of assembly. In other words, the word church doesn't really explain this. It's an assembly and a congregation, a called out assembly. So it's in our hands and how we behave that identifies the assembly. So how can we be sure we're in the right assembly? How do we identify it? Well, in John 13:34, "A new commandment I'm going to give you," Jesus says. "You are to love one another." And he goes on to say in verse 35, "All will know, everyone will know, the whole world will know that you are my disciples, you are my assembly, if you have love for one another." So it's in our hands. How we behave identifies the true assembly, the true church, if you want to use the word church, but assembly is a far better meaning, or congregation. But you might be saying, well, what about church doctrines? Because we have lots of unique doctrines, don't we? Are they important? First Corinthians 13:2 says you can have all knowledge and all mystery. You can understand everything in the Bible and all the different doctrines, but if you don't have love, it's nothing. Love is so important. But then you might be saying, what about the Sabbath? Isn't the Sabbath a sign? Yes, it is. But there's far more to it. Let's go to Mark 2. In Mark 2, and I'm sure many of you know the story, the disciples are walking through a grain crop. And it happens to be the Sabbath, and the Pharisees are on the lookout, and some of the disciples pick some grain and they rub it in their hands to get those fluffy outer stalks off, and they eat it. And the Pharisees then accuse them of breaking the Sabbath because they're working on the Sabbath. Now, we need to understand this in the context of what the Jews believed, because the Jews had something called the oral Torah. It's not the written Torah in the Bible. It's their own rules. And they had 39 categories of work that were prohibited on the Sabbath. And two of the things that were prohibited on the Sabbath, one was reaping, which the disciples were doing by picking the grain, and another one was threshing. And if they were rubbing those heads of grain together, that was defined as threshing. So they were breaking the Sabbath. Jesus comes back and says, he reminds them about David and the showbread. And then he says something absolutely amazing. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. In other words, the Sabbath is God's gift to man. It's a gift to us. It's a gift to us. It's God's loving gift to us. So if we see this as a gift from God, we're going to really cherish it. We're going to like it. We're going to love it. We're going to want to keep it. Not because there are 39 rules on how to keep it, because we want to keep it. It's a totally different way of looking at the Sabbath commandment, and it reflects love. It reflects love. That's what it does. Consequently, notice now we go to Ephesians. And I'm going to look at Ephesians now because we can see how other analogies show how assembly is really what the church is, what they're talking about here. Because here we're members of the household. We're no longer foreigners. We're called out ones now into the members of the household, built on the foundations of apostles and prophets, with Jesus as the cornerstone. A building term, a cornerstone, analogy being used to a building here. In him, the whole building is joined together, becoming a temple. And remember how I said in Matthew 16, you could translate this as being a building in Matthew 16, building a house. And now we are being built to become a dwelling in which God's Spirit lives. We're becoming a building. That's what we're becoming. But do we have a responsibility? If we're members of this assembly, members of this congregation, members of this called out congregation, do we have responsibilities? Well, one of the striking features of the early church, now we're talking about the first century church here, mainly made up of Jews, and notice that every member was seen as having a gift for service. And that gift was to be used cooperatively for the benefit of all. And he quotes 1 Peter 4:10 there. Notice 1 Peter 4:10 says, whatever gift you have, and it doesn't say those of you with gift. In other words, it reads as everyone has a gift. Everyone has a gift. You are to use that gift to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace. In other words, we have been given God's Spirit, which gives us spiritual gifts. We didn't deserve it. It's from God's grace, but we are expected to be faithful stewards of that. And one of the ways we are stewards of that is to serve others, to show love to others. Remember, that's the sign of the true assembly. Notice what it says back in Ephesians this time, chapter 4. In 4:11, he says, we've got these different roles of apostles and pastors and teachers, all these different roles. But notice the purpose of these roles. It is to equip people for works of service. So it's equipping God's people for works of service. Some translations say the saints here, and some say for service ministry. But I think it really means God's people are here to serve. That's what the underlying Greek word means. So the body of Christ is built up until we reach a unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, so that we've been built up. Then, if we do have acts of service, if we do these acts of service, it will stop us being deceived. We will no longer be tossed back and forwards by stormy waves, by every wind of cunning, deceitful doctrines. We won't be deceived, because this is one of the ways we won't be deceived, because we'll be part of assembly and we'll be showing love to one another. That will stop us being deceived. Instead of being deceived, we'll speak truth in love. We'll grow to maturity, and then we'll become a whole body. Join every supporting ligament. Every part does its work. Every member of that assembly has a spiritual gift, and every member has a part to play and exercising God's spiritual gifts for work for others. I started with a question. What is the true church? You and me. We are the true church, or better translated, the true assembly, or called out congregation. We are the assembly. It's not some organization. We are the assembly. I also asked another question. Are we in the right church? In many ways, that's the wrong question, because we are the church, or better translated, the assembly or the congregation. The better question to ask, are we individually and collectively, through acts of love and acts of service, showing an example to the whole world, a sign to the whole world that we are the true church, or better translated, the true assembly or true congregation? That's the question.